The fine was 300 galactic credits. That was what started it. Nora Webb had been sitting in the tribunal's lower processing office for 6 hours when the clerk finally called her number. The clerk was a Mareth, small, rust-colored, with thin fingers that moved over the desk console without looking at it. It read the charge aloud without looking at her either. Unauthorized biological presence on restricted planetary body, designation Oru 7. Fine assessed at 300 galactic credits, payable within 30 standard days. Nora said she did not have 300 credits. The clerk said that was not its problem. Nora said she understood that, but she wanted to explain how she ended up on Oru 7 in the first place, because she thought the explanation might be relevant. The clerk said explanations were not part of the fine processing procedure. Nora said she had been on Oru 7 for 14 months. The clerk stopped moving its fingers on the console. It looked at her for the first time. It looked at her the way something looks at a thing that has said a word in the wrong language, not angry, just suddenly uncertain about what it was dealing with. Oru 7 was not a planet that had a fine attached to unauthorized presence. Oru 7 was a planet where unauthorized presence was supposed to result in death, quickly and without drama, because the planet handled that part itself. The tribunal's job was simply to put the fine on the record afterward for the next of kin. Nobody had ever come to pay it in person before. The clerk called its supervisor. The supervisor called the department head. The department head looked at Nora Webb, 31 years old, short brown hair growing out unevenly, a scar along her left jaw that had not been there in her registration photo, wearing clothes that had been repaired so many times the original fabric was hard to identify, and made a decision that would eventually change the way the tribunal thought about an entire species. The department head filed an emergency case report and called security, not to arrest Nora, to make sure nothing happened to her before someone senior could talk to her, because whatever this woman was, she was currently the most interesting thing to walk through the office doors in 20 years. Nora sat down in the waiting area and accepted a cup of something warm that the clerk brought her without being asked. She drank it without checking what it was, which the clerk noted and found either very brave or very tired, possibly both. The emergency case went up the chain fast. By the time it reached Senior Magistrate Quareth's office, it had already gathered 4 attached documents, 2 scientific flags, and a note from the department head that said simply, "She is calm. She should not be calm." Quareth read the file. Then he read it again. 14 months on Oru 7. Life signs confirmed on entry via the automated border station, which had logged her arrival and then logged nothing further because nothing further was supposed to be needed. The automated system had been set to record the moment biological signs ceased, which was standard procedure for restricted planets, and add the fine to the next of kin file. The system had been waiting 14 months for the biological signs to cease. They had not ceased. He authorized a formal hearing for the following morning and then sat at his desk for a long time doing nothing, which was unusual for him. He was trying to remember if there had ever been a case like this. He was a thorough person and he had a good memory. He could not find one. The hearing chamber the next morning was not the main tribunal hall. It was a smaller room used for preliminary cases, with seating for 40 observers and a low ceiling that gave it a close, pressured feeling. By the time the session opened, all 40 seats were full, and people were standing in the corridor outside with the door open. Word had moved fast. It always did when something was genuinely new. Nora came in without an escort. She had been offered one and declined it. She sat in the respondent chair and put her hands flat on the table in front of her, which was a human gesture that meant different things to different species watching. To most of them, it read as either aggression or surrender. To the tribunal's human cultural consultant, who had been called in overnight and was sitting in the back row looking like she had not slept, it read as neither. It read as someone who had learned to keep their hands visible in places where sudden movements were dangerous. Quareth opened the session. He asked Nora to state, for the record, how she had come to be on Oru 7. She said her cargo hauler had lost navigation 6 weeks out from the Den Station route. She said she had no distress beacon because it had been broken for 2 months, and she had not had the money to fix it. She said she had found Oru 7 on her charts as the nearest body with a solid surface, and she had landed because the alternative was drifting until the life support ran out. Quoreth asked if she had been aware of Oru 7's classification. She said she had seen the restricted marker on the chart. She said she had also seen her oxygen reserves dropping below 30%, and she had made a decision. The room was quiet in a way that suggested everyone was doing the same math and arriving at the same place. There was not a good choice in that situation. There was a choice between 2 bad ones, and Nora had picked the one that gave her a chance, and the planet had not taken it. Quoreth asked her to describe her time on the surface. She reached into the bag she had carried in and pulled out a stack of paper, real paper, covered in dense handwriting and rough drawings, and set it on the table. She said she would rather show him than tell him because she was better at writing than talking when it came to things like this, and she had had 14 months to write. The cultural consultant in the back row leaned forward. Quoreth looked at the stack of paper. He looked at Nora. He asked if she understood that the fine was the smallest of the legal questions currently on the table, and that the tribunal had significant concerns about what her survival implied about her biological status. She said she understood that. She said she also thought their concerns were probably based on incomplete information about what Oru 7 was actually like, and that the paper would help with that. She pushed the stack across the table toward him. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the room full of alien observers all leaning forward in their seats, and at the people standing in the corridor, and at the cultural consultant in the back row who looked like she was trying not to visibly react to whatever she was thinking. He picked up the paper. He read the first page standing up, which he did not usually do. Then he sat down and kept reading. The room stayed quiet. Nora drank the second cup of warm liquid that the processing clerk had sent in with her. She waited. She was good at waiting. 14 months on Oru 7 had given her that, among other things. She watched Quoreth's face while he read. She had gotten good at reading faces on Oru 7, where most of the things that had faces were trying to kill her, and the difference between their expressions mattered. Quoreth's face did not tell her much, but his hands, resting on the paper, had gone very still. She took that as a reasonable sign. Not all at once. The landing had been hard but survivable, and the hull had held through the initial impact. It was the ground itself that finished the job. Oru 7's surface in the region where Nora came down was a lattice of interconnected fissures, some of them narrow enough to miss, and some of them wide enough to swallow a cargo hauler by degrees. The ship sank 3 meters into the lattice over the first 2 weeks, tilting as it went, until the lower cargo bay was permanently underwater with something that was not water, and the cockpit was angled at 40 degrees, and she could not sleep in the pilot's seat anymore without sliding. She stripped the ship before it went. She had 2 weeks of warning from the way the ground moved, and she used every hour of them. She pulled food stores, tools, the emergency kit, the water recycler, both survival suits, all the spare parts she could carry, the navigation console because it had data she needed, the fire suppression canisters because the chemicals in them turned out to be useful for reasons the manufacturer had not intended, and the cushion from the pilot's seat because she was pragmatic about comfort. She set up on a flat shelf of rock 40 meters from the ship, uphill from the fissure lattice, with a clear view in 3 directions. This was not comfort. This was position. On Oru 7, position was the first thing that mattered and everything else was second. The planet did not look like a Deathworld in the way she had expected. She had expected something visually obvious, acid skis, rivers of something burning, ground that moved in ways ground was not supposed to move. Oru 7 was not that. Oru 7 looked almost calm. The sky was a pale gray-violet. The ground was dark, almost purple-black in places, with a texture like compressed ash. The air was breathable inside the survival suit and only mildly toxic outside it, which meant a few minutes of exposure was uncomfortable but not immediately lethal. The temperature was cold but not extreme. There was no acid rain. What Oru 7 had instead was subtler, and she came to understand much worse. The first indication was on day 3 when she found animal tracks. Large ones, circular prints with 5 pressure points, pressed deep into the soft ash rock near her water source. She had not seen what made them. She set up a simple alert wire around her camp perimeter that night using wire from the ship's electrical system, tied it to empty containers that would rattle if touched, and slept with her eyes on the perimeter. Nothing touched the wire. In the morning, the tracks were closer than the night before. Whatever made them had come within 8 meters of her while she slept and had not touched the wire. She checked the wire, it was intact. She checked the ground. The prints went around the wire, around it, not through it. She sat with that information for a long time. Then she reset the wire in a different pattern and spent the next 2 nights not sleeping but watching. On the second night, she saw one of them. It was large. That was the first thing. Large enough that the size of it against the pale sky was the thing she registered before any detail. It moved low to the ground despite its size, in a way that distributed its weight broadly, which was why the prints were so wide. The body was dark and smooth and difficult to see against the dark ground, which she suspected was not an accident. It circled her camp at a distance, slow and unhurried, and at one point it stopped and she could see the head turn toward her. 2 eyes, pale and reflective, catching the light from her small fire. It stayed for 11 minutes, she had counted, then it left. She wrote in her notes, "It came to look, it did not come to eat. There is a difference and I need to understand it." The planet had 7 of them in her region, she figured out over the following weeks. 7 large predators, moving in loose coordination without being a pack exactly, sharing territory without fighting over it, which suggested a level of social organization she had not expected from something that looked like a pure ambush hunter. They had routines. She mapped the routines. She learned where they rested during the warmest part of the day, which routes they traveled at night, which areas they avoided and why. The areas they avoided were the actually dangerous parts of Oru 7. That was the thing the tribunal's classification reports had missed, she realized by the end of the first month. They had sent probes, which had no instincts, and the probes had gone into the dangerous areas because probes followed direct routes and did not know to avoid things. The predators knew. The predators had a map of the planet in their behavior, written in where they went and where they did not, and once Nora understood that she started using them as a guide. The fissure lattice was only in certain geological zones. The plant life in the southern lowlands produced a compound that accumulated in the respiratory system over time, and was why the air outside a suit was only tolerable for short periods. The rock formations in the eastern ridge area were unstable in ways that were not visible, but the predators never walked under them. She learned each of these things by watching where the large creatures went and going there, and by watching where they did not go and staying away. She began to think of them as the planet's instructions. If you could read the instructions, the planet was not so impossible. She ate on Oru 7 by trial and the kind of careful error that left bruises but not permanent damage. The planet had vegetation in the ash rock crevices, small and dense and dark-colored. Most of it was not edible. She tested everything in the smallest possible amount, waited the full reaction period she had learned from the survival guide she had memorized 3 years ago for a different trip entirely, and recorded the results. By month 2, she had 4 confirmed food sources. 1 confirmed medicinal plant she had found by accident when a cut on her hand healed faster after she fell into a patch of it, and a list of 11 things that were definitely not food under any circumstances. She also had a name for the largest of the predators, because she needed to think about them somehow and names helped her think. She called the largest one gray because its bioluminescent patches, she found these on month 3 when she first saw one of them at night, were cooler in color than the others. She called the second largest patch because of a lighter section on its left shoulder. The fastest one she called Arrow. The one that watched her the most she called Witness. Witness was the one that changed things. It started on day 62, when Witness sat outside her camp perimeter for 4 hours instead of the usual 11 minutes. She sat inside and worked on her notes and did not react. On day 68, it sat for 6 hours. On day 71, it sat until she went asleep, and when she woke at the shift in night temperature that she had learned to use as a reliable alarm, it was still there. She wrote, "It is not watching for weakness. It is watching for information." On day 80, she went outside while Witness was there. She moved slowly, sat down on the flat rock near her camp entrance, and did the thing she had been planning for a week. She took out her notebook and started writing. Not watching it, not ignoring it, just doing a task. Letting it see a person working. Letting it see her as something with habits rather than something to hunt. Witness did not move. It watched. It watched her write for 2 hours. Then it stood, stretched in a way that briefly doubled its apparent height, and walked away in the direction of the eastern ridge. The next morning its tracks were 2 meters closer to her camp than they had ever been before. She wrote one line that night at the end of a long entry. "I think it is trying to understand me. I think we are doing the same thing." Quareth read 41 pages before he called anyone else into the room. By that point, the preliminary hearing had been technically in recess for 2 hours. Nora had been given a meal, which she ate with the focus of someone who had not taken food for granted in a long time. The 40 observers who had been in the room had mostly stayed, some of them standing now, quiet in the way people go quiet when they understand something significant is happening and do not want to break it. The pages Quareth read were not a survival account in the sense he had expected. They were not dramatic. They did not describe suffering in detail or close calls in emotional language. They were closer to a field journal, dated entries, careful observations, diagrams in the margins drawn with a steady hand, plant identification sketches, terrain maps, behavioral tables for the 7 large predators, tracking movement patterns across months with a consistency that suggested she had been doing it every day without fail. On page 22, there was a section that he read twice, and then set the page down and looked at the wall for a moment before continuing. It was a passage about something she called the avoidance map, her term for the navigation system she had built by tracking where Oru 7's predators refused to go. The passage described how she had identified 11 specific areas of the planet as genuinely lethal through methods that no tribunal probe had ever used, because no tribunal probe had thought to watch the local wildlife for behavioral cues about the terrain. Every one of the tribunal's probes that had been lost on Oru 7 in the past 2 centuries had been lost in areas that appeared on Nora Webb's avoidance map. Quareth set the pages down. He asked the 2 science observers who had stayed in the room to come forward. One was a Velen biologist named Proth who had studied restricted planets for 30 years. The other was a younger fairy geologist whose name Quareth had not caught. He told them what was in the passage. He watched their faces. Proth said, "That is not possible. Our probes use the best available sensor array for terrain hazard detection." Quareth said, "The probes also have a 100% loss rate on Oru 7. The human does not." The fairy geologist asked if she could see the maps. Quareth passed the relevant pages across the table. She looked at them for 3 minutes without speaking. Then she said, quietly, that the areas marked on the map matched the projected distribution zones for a subsurface geological phenomenon called resonance collapse, which was a known but poorly documented hazard on planets with Oru 7's mineral composition, which destabilized the ground surface from below and left no visible warning signs. Proth said, Our probes cannot detect resonance collapse. The fairy geologist said, apparently the predators can. The room was quiet again. Outside in the corridor, someone who had been listening through the open door relayed something to the people behind them, and a sound moved down the corridor like a slow wave. Quorath authorized a full scientific review mission to Oru 7 that afternoon, which was the fastest he had authorized anything in his career. He assigned Proth to lead it. He gave them 1 week to prepare and sent a note to the equipment division that said the probes for this mission needed to be programmed differently, and that he would explain what that meant after he finished reading the remaining 30 pages. The mission departed 9 days later. Proth had fought for the extra 2 days and won them, because the equipment division needed the time to reprogram the probe navigation systems to avoid the areas on Nora's map, and also to record behavioral data from any local fauna encountered rather than defaulting to threat evasion protocols. The fairy geologist, whose name was Teth, had asked to be on the mission. Proth had agreed because Teth was the only one who had understood the resonance collapse implication immediately, and Proth was experienced enough to know that immediate understanding of a new idea was rare and worth keeping close. They entered Oru 7's atmosphere on a gray-violet morning, and the planet looked calm from above, which Proth had read about in the previous mission reports and now found more alarming than reassuring. The first probe deployed successfully and began following the navigation parameters from Nora's map. It avoided the 11 marked areas. It lasted past the 40-hour mark that had been the previous record. It was still transmitting at 70 hours. At 92 hours, when the team gathered around the feed with attention that nobody commented on aloud, it found Nora's camp. The camp was still standing. More than standing, it had been maintained. The structures were solid, the supply areas organized, the exterior of the site showing the kind of long-term modification that happened when someone treated a temporary camp as a residence. Proth looked at it and thought, she was not surviving, she was living. The probe moved through the camp slowly, recording everything. The supply logs detailed and dated. The tool wall, hanging with implements made from ship parts and local materials, labeled with Nora's handwriting. The plant samples pressed between flat pieces of dark rock, organized by edibility category with testing notes attached. The notebook stack 40 notebooks made of salvaged material, each one filled front to back, spines facing out, numbered in order. Then the probe found the behavioral tables on the wall of the main structure, which Nora had transferred from her notebooks to a larger format using the inside surface of a flattened cargo container. Months of data, organized by creature and by date, tracking movement patterns, interaction distances, behavioral states, the bioluminescent color sequences she had cataloged and was apparently in the process of cross-referencing. Proth called Teth over and pointed at the color sequence data. Teth looked at it for a long time and said, "She thinks they are communicating." Proth said, "Is she wrong?" Teth looked at the data again. She said she did not know yet. She said it would take months of proper study to determine whether the sequences were communicative or purely physiological. She said that nobody had ever had months of behavioral observation data on Oru 7's apex species before because nobody had ever been on the planet long enough to collect it. She said, quietly, that the dataset on that wall was the most significant biological observation record for a class-level restricted planet that she had ever seen, and that it had been compiled by a cargo hauler pilot with no formal scientific training using a notebook and a pencil. Proth went back to the main feed without answering. He watched the probe circle the outside of the camp. He watched it stop when it detected large biological presences approaching from the eastern direction, 3 of Oru 7's apex predators, moving along a path that brought them to within 20 meters of the camp. The probe's threat protocols tried to engage. Proth overrode them manually, which he had not done in 30 years of field work. The 3 predators stopped at the camp perimeter. One of them, larger than the others, with cooler-colored bioluminescent patches along its sides, turned its head toward the probe. The probe had no fire, no smell, no behavioral signals it was producing. It was just a machine. The predator looked at it for 30 seconds and then looked away, apparently satisfied with whatever conclusion it had reached, and the three of them moved on along their route without altering their pace. Proth said they checked it. The junior researcher next to him said, "Sorry." Proth said, "They came to check what was in the camp. It was not her, so they checked what it was, decided it was not a problem, and left. They have a protocol for this camp." He stopped. He thought about what he had just said. He thought about 14 months of regular visits from an apex predator species to a human's campsite. He said, "They have had one for a long time." He filed his first report to Quorath that evening. It was 6 pages long and contained one sentence that he had rewritten 4 times before he was satisfied with the wording. The sentence said, "The preliminary evidence suggests that the subject did not merely survive Oru 7, but established a functional ecological position within it, and that the planet's apex predator species has incorporated her presence into its behavioral baseline." He read the sentence one more time after writing it. Then he sent the report before he could think of a reason not to. The debate inside the tribunal lasted 4 days, which was not long by tribunal standards but felt long to the people watching it from the observer galleries. The argument had split roughly into 3 positions. The first position said Nora Webb should be classified as a biological anomaly, studied under controlled conditions, and the fine should be waived on humanitarian grounds. The second position said her survival represented an unknown threat vector, and she should be held in containment until the scientific review was complete. The third position, put forward by a small coalition of magistrates from the outer council, said the tribunal should take no action at all until someone explained to them how a human cargo hauler pilot had done in 14 months what 3 centuries of tribunal scientific effort had failed to do. Quorath found the third position the most honest of the 3. He did not say this publicly. While the debate continued above her, Nora was housed in the tribunal station's visitor quarter, which was comfortable in a generic way that suggested it had been designed for many different species and suited none of them perfectly. She had been given access to the station's general information network, which she used for 6 hours a day to read everything available about Oru 7. The historical classification reports, the probe mission logs, the biological threat assessments. She read them carefully and made notes in a new notebook that the station's supply office had provided when she asked, because she had filled the last of her Oru 7 notebooks on the journey here. On the 3rd day of her stay, a Velen researcher knocked on her door. This was Proth, back from the preliminary site visit, still carrying the slightly distant look of someone whose assumptions had recently been rearranged. He introduced himself and said he had some questions if she was willing. She said she was willing and moved her notes off the second chair so he could sit. What followed was 3 hours of conversation that Proth later described in his personal log as the most professionally disorienting experience of his career, and he had once spent 6 months on a planet where the atmosphere was slowly changing phase states. The disorientation came not from anything Nora said being wrong. Most of it was precisely right, but from the way she said it. She talked about Oru 7, geological hazard zones, with the casual confidence of someone who had walked through them repeatedly. She talked about the predator behavioral sequences with the kind of detail that took years of formal academic work to produce in a laboratory context. She sketched a revised terrain map on a blank page in her notebook during the conversation, from memory, that matched the geological survey data Proth's team had collected more accurately than 2 of the 3 instruments they had brought. At one point, he asked her how she had learned to identify the resonance collapse zones without instruments. She said she had learned it from the predators first, and then looked for the geological pattern underneath the behavioral one. She said once you knew what the ground sounded like in stable zones versus unstable ones, She had spent 2 months tapping rock faces with a metal rod and listening. You could feel the difference through your feet before the collapse risk became acute. Proth asked if he could see the acoustic testing data. She handed him Notebook 17. He read Notebook 17 in the evenings over the next 2 days, and then read Notebook 18 because 17 referenced it, and then read Notebooks 19 and 20 because 18 referenced them. He slept very little during this period. He sent 3 messages to Quarath with subject lines that became progressively less formal. The third one said only, "I think we have been classifying the wrong thing." What he meant, and what he explained properly in his official report, was this. The Tribunal's classification system for restricted planets worked by measuring hazard levels using probe data. The probes measured what they could detect. What they could detect was direct physical, hazard, chemical composition, temperature, seismic activity, biological threat response when approached. They did not measure what a planet was like to understand, because understanding was not something a probe could do. Oru 7 was lethal in specific zones and survivable in others. The survivable zones were readable to anything with instincts, pattern recognition, and the patience to observe before acting. The probes had none of these. Every probe the Tribunal had sent to Oru 7 had treated the planet as a uniform hazard and moved through it in straight lines, which was why every probe had eventually found one of the lethal zones and stopped transmitting. Nora had done none of these things. She had landed, assessed her situation, and then spent 14 months learning to read a planet the same way she apparently learned most things, by watching what was already alive there and paying attention. Proth's report framed this carefully because he was a careful person, but the implication was clear enough that the magistrate who read it sent it to 3 colleagues before end of day, and 2 of them sent it to 3 more. Quarath convened a special session on the 4th day, smaller than the main hearings, with only 12 people in the room. He invited Nora. He did not frame the invitation as optional, but he phrased it politely, which Nora had noticed he always did, and she came in and sat across the long table from the 12 observers and did not appear to find this intimidating. One of the outer council magistrates asked her directly, did she think the Tribunal's classification of Oru 7 was wrong? She said she thought the classification was based on real data. She said the planet was genuinely dangerous in the zones the classification system had detected hazards in. She said the issue was that the classification treated the planet as a single uniform environment rather than a system with internal variation, and that the variation mattered a great deal to anyone trying to operate there. Someone asked if she thought other humans could survive on Oru 7 with the information she had. She said that depended entirely on the human. She said surviving on a planet like Oru 7 required a specific way of approaching new information, and not everyone had that way, and she did not think it was something you could teach in a briefing. She said it was more like a habit of paying attention that either became automatic over time or did not. Someone asked where that habit came from. She thought about it for a moment. She said she thought it came from Earth. She said Earth was not a comfortable planet and never had been, and that growing up there made you either someone who paid close attention to your environment or someone who eventually had a serious problem. She said most humans fell somewhere in the middle, and the ones who ended up doing field work in difficult places tended to be the ones who had paid more attention than average for most of their lives. The room was quiet. The outer council magistrate who had asked the first question looked at his notes and then looked at Nora and said, "You are describing a selection process." She said yes, roughly. He said, "Your planet selects for people like you." She said she would not have put it that way because it made it sound more deliberate than it was. She said Earth selected for people who notice things, and that noticing things was useful in a lot of different places for a lot of different reasons, and that Oru 7 happened to be one of them. Quarath had not spoken for most of the session. He spoke now. He asked her, quietly, what she would do if the tribunal offered her a formal research designation for Oru 7. She looked at him steadily. She said she would go back. She said there were 40 notebooks of observation data, and she had only started cross-referencing the predator communication sequences, and she wanted to know whether the sequences were actually language or something else, and she could not find out from here. She said Witness had been getting closer to her camp for the last 3 months before she left, and she did not want to lose the progress. Quoreth asked who Witness was. She said it was the one that had been studying her the longest. She said she thought they had been doing the same thing to each other, and she wanted to see where it went. The magistrate 4 seats down from Quoreth made a sound that the translation system classified as involuntary. He covered it quickly, but not quickly enough. Several people looked at him. He looked at the table. Quoreth ended the session 20 minutes later. He sat at the long table after everyone had gone and looked at the chair where Nora had been sitting. He thought about 40 notebooks. He thought about a planet that had stopped 300 years of tribunal probes and had apparently, in its own unhurried way, been getting curious about the first person who had ever bothered to be curious back. He drafted the research authorization that evening. He wrote it carefully. He had been a magistrate for a long time, and he knew that the documents that changed the record had to be right the first time. The full tribunal session was called for the 7th day, which gave the news channels 4 days to decide how to cover something they did not fully understand. Most of them led with the survival angle, which was the simplest version of the story and the easiest to explain in a short broadcast. Human survives Deathworld. Fine assessed. Human arrives to pay fine in person. The coverage at that level drew significant public attention across 17 systems. Most of it focused on the survival itself, the sheer improbability of a single person walking out of a class-level restricted planet alive. What the broadcast did not cover, because none of the journalists had access to the scientific review materials, was everything else. The avoidance map, the 40 notebooks, the predator behavioral tables, the acoustic testing data, the 3-way cross-reference between terrain geology, fauna movement patterns, and seasonal atmospheric variation that Nora had been quietly building for 14 months because she had nothing else to do, and it seemed like the kind of thing that mattered. The full tribunal hall was at capacity for the first time in 11 years. Quoreth had requested that the session be broadcast on the station's public feed, which was unusual, and which 2 of the other magistrates had objected to on procedural grounds. He had overruled them on the basis that the case had already attracted public interest, and that conducting it behind closed access would raise more questions than it answered. The real reason, which he did not state, was that he thought what was about to happen in that chamber deserved to be seen. Nora came in through the lower entry carrying 2 things: her current notebook and a flat case that held selected pages from the Oru 7-field notebooks, which the station's document office had helped her copy onto more durable material. She had asked for this 3 days ago and explained why she needed it, and the document office had done it without being told twice, which she appreciated. She stood at the respondent platform, without the flat table she had used in the preliminary hearing. Just the platform, the chamber, and 800 observers. She did not scan the room the way nervous people did. She looked at the magistrate bench directly, found Quoreth, and gave a small nod that was not exactly formal but was something. He did not nod back, but something in his posture shifted in a way that the human cultural consultant, sitting in the same back row seat as before, recognized as acknowledgement. Quoreth opened by reading the case summary into the record, which took 12 minutes and covered the initial find, the emergency report, the preliminary hearing, the scientific mission, and the special session. He read it without editorial. When he finished, he said that the tribunal had received the scientific review team's preliminary findings and had some questions about those findings that the respondent might be able to address. He then did something that 2 of the other magistrates later described as irregular, and one later described as the right call. He asked Nora to present her field data in her own format, in whatever order made sense to her, and said the tribunal would hold its questions until she was finished. She set the notebook on the platform railing and opened the case. She took out the first page. She started with the map. The map was projected onto the main chamber display via the copy the document office had made. It covered Oru 7's surveyed surface area and showed the 11 avoidance zones marked clearly, with the reasoning for each one annotated in the margins: terrain indicators, predator behavior patterns, her own acoustic testing results where applicable. She walked through each zone. She explained how she had identified it. She explained what would happen to anything that entered it unprepared, and how she knew, and how long it had taken her to be certain enough to trust the data. She was matter-of-fact about all of it. She was not performing. She was explaining, the way someone explains a route they know well to someone who will have to travel it themselves. When she reached Zone 4 on the map, she paused because Zone 4 was the one that had nearly killed her. She said this without drama. She said she had made an error in the acoustic reading for that zone because the mineral composition at the entry point was atypical and skewed the result. And she had entered the zone, and the ground had started to fail under her at about 20 meters in, and she had moved out quickly and recalibrated her testing method. She showed the revised testing protocol she had developed afterward. She said the revised method had a much higher confidence rating, and she had been using it since month 4. One of the magistrates on the bench, the four-eyed one who had been visibly interested since the preliminary hearing, asked what quickly meant in that situation. She said about 4 seconds. She said the collapse was not instantaneous, it was progressive, and if you were paying attention, you had a few seconds to move. The four-eyed magistrate said, and if you were not paying attention. She said then, you did not have 4 seconds. The chamber was very quiet. She moved on to the predator data. She showed the behavioral tables. She explained the tracking methodology and the time frames. She showed the bioluminescent sequence records she had compiled, which were represented as a simplified color chart with frequencies, and she explained that she believed the sequences were information carrying based on correlation patterns she had found between specific sequences and subsequent behavioral changes in the animals. Proth, sitting in the Science Observer section, leaned toward the fairy geologist Teth and said quietly that the correlation analysis was methodologically sound. Teth said she knew. She had checked it 3 times. Nora showed the closest approach records. She showed the data on witness specifically, the progressive reduction in standoff distance over 14 months, the change in duration of visits, the shift in the creature's orientation from lateral observation to direct facing, which in her behavioral notes she had flagged as a shift from threat assessment to something she had only been willing to call social engagement after 6 months of consistent evidence. She said she was not claiming the predator was friendly. She was claiming it had made a decision about her, and the decision was not to treat her as prey, and the decision appeared to be stable, and she wanted to study what had driven it. She said she had a hypothesis. She said the hypothesis was that Oru 7's apex predators had a category for things that were not prey and not threat, and not part of the standard environmental background, a category for things that were curious, things that paid attention, things that came to look without aggression and came back again. She said she thought she had ended up in that category. She said she did not know if this was because of something specific she had done or because of what she was, and she wanted to find out. The chamber was at the specific kind of silence that large spaces reach when everyone in them is doing the same thing, which was thinking. Quareth said, "What do you need to find out?" She said she needed to go back. She needed proper equipment this time, recording instruments, a secondary observer if the tribunal would allow it. She needed time, at least another year, she said, probably 2, because the behavioral patterns she was tracking moved slowly and she did not want to rush the data and get the wrong answer. She said one more thing. She said it without looking down at her notes, which meant she had been thinking about how to say it for a while. She said that Oru 7 had not tried to kill her out of malice. She said a planet did not have malice. It had conditions, and some conditions were lethal, and the lethal ones were survivable if you understood them. She said the tribunal had been treating Oru 7 as a wall when it was actually a door, and that the difference between those two things was only whether you knew how to read the surface. She said she could teach people to read it, not everyone, the right people, the ones who already knew how to pay attention. She closed the notebook case. Quareth called the deliberation recess. It lasted 40 minutes, which was short. The decision that came out of it was not entirely a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention since the preliminary hearing, but hearing it stated formally in the full chamber still produced a sound from the 800 observers that the translation system did not try to classify. The fine was waived. The research authorization was granted. The restricted classification of Oru 7 was moved to monitored research status, which was a category the tribunal had used only twice before in its history. And in a line that had been added to the authorization document by Quareth himself at the end of the previous evening, Nora Webb was named as the primary site researcher for Oru 7. The first time that designation had ever been given to a human, and the first time it had ever been given to someone who had not applied for it. She looked at the authorization document when it was handed to her on the platform. She read the last line twice. Then she looked up at Quareth and said thank you, which the translation system rendered accurately and which produced another sound from the observers that was quieter and harder to categorize. Quareth said, "Return with good data." She said she intended to. Witness was waiting. Nora did not know this when the ship entered Oru 7's atmosphere on a gray-violet morning 6 weeks after the tribunal session. She did not know it when the landing site came into view through the cockpit window, the flat shelf of rock above the fissure lattice exactly as she had left it, except that the ship wreck in the fissure below had sunk another half-meter and was almost gone. She did not know it until she stepped out of the ship onto the dark ash-rock surface and looked toward the eastern ridge and saw the large shape sitting at the ridge line, still and patient against the pale sky, and recognized the cooler color of the bioluminescent patches along its sides. She stood still for a moment. Then she said to herself and to no one in particular, "I was not gone that long." Behind her, the secondary observer the tribunal had assigned came down the ship ramp and stopped beside her. His name was Rael, and he was a Marath biologist who had spent 20 years studying predator species on 4 different planets, none of which were restricted class. He had read all 40 notebooks on the journey here. He had asked 412 questions during the reading, which Nora had answered as many of as she could, and the rest she had said he would understand when he got there. He looked at the ridge, he looked at Witness, he said, "That is one of the apex predators." She said yes. He said, "It is not moving." She said no. He said, "It has been there since before we landed. It heard the ship and came to the ridge." She said probably. She said it knew what a ship sounded like because the ship that crashed had made noise coming in too, and Witness had been near enough to hear it. She said the predators had very good acoustic memory, which she had documented in Notebook 31. Rull was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It came to see if it was you." She looked at him. He was watching Witness with the expression of someone recalculating. She said she did not know that for certain. He said he was a predator behaviorist, and in his professional opinion that was exactly what that was, and he would like to start the recording equipment as soon as possible. She said that was why he was here. They rebuilt the camp in 3 days. Rull was useful in ways she had not fully anticipated. He was methodical and fast, and he did not ask unnecessary questions during tasks, which she valued. He also had equipment she had not had before, proper recording instruments, a soil analysis kit, atmospheric sensors that could detect chemical gradients at distances her nose could not. The chemical gradient data in particular, opened 3 lines of investigation she had been unable to pursue from observation alone, because it turned out the predators were producing compounds in their bioluminescent sequences that were chemically distinct from one another, which was either a communication mechanism or the most elaborate coincidence she had ever encountered in her life. Rull thought it was not a coincidence. He said so on day 4 while reviewing the first round of sensor data, using the precise and careful language of a scientist being careful not to claim more than the data showed. And then at the end of his analysis he said, "They are talking." She said she had thought so. He said, "You thought so from behavioral observation with no chemical detection equipment." She said yes. He said how? She said she had noticed that specific sequences preceded specific behaviors consistently enough that the relationship seemed non-random, and that non-random relationships between signal and behavior were what language looked like from the outside before you knew what the signal meant. She said she had 40 notebooks of correlation data if he wanted to review the methodology. He had already read all 40 notebooks on the ship. He said he knew. He said he was asking because he wanted to understand her process, not the data. He said her process was the part that was not in the notebooks. She thought about this. She said her process was basically, assume everything means something until proven otherwise, because in a place that is trying to kill you, the things you ignore are usually the things that matter. Rull was quiet for a moment. He wrote something in his own notebook. He said, "That is not standard scientific methodology." She said she knew. He said, "It is better." She did not respond to this because she was watching Witness, who had come down from the ridge line that afternoon and was currently sitting at the camp perimeter at a distance of 11 meters, which was closer than the previous record of 14. She was measuring the distance with the ranging instrument Rull had brought and nodding it without reaction, because reacting to Witness closing distance had always set the progress back. You showed Witness that you had noticed. You did not show Witness that the noticing meant anything to you. Rull watched her not react. He watched her continue doing exactly what she had been doing before Witness arrived, reviewing the previous day's sensor data, while maintaining peripheral awareness of the predator in the way of someone who had practiced it, until it was no longer conscious effort. He wrote something else in his notebook. On day 19, Witness made the closest approach yet, not to Nora, to Rull. Rull was outside running a soil composition test on the near side of the camp when he became aware that the usual background sounds of the planet had changed in the specific way he had already learned, meant a predator was close and not moving. He finished the sample he was taking. He did not look up. He logged the time and continued with the next sample, and then when the sample was complete he sat back on his heels and looked at the ground in front of him and waited. Witness was 6 meters away. This was not in the previous behavioral record. 6 meters was a completely new distance and both of them knew it. Rull sat still. He felt, he later told Nora, an extremely clear and specific version of the fear response that he was professionally familiar with from years of predator research. And he also felt something underneath it that he could only describe as being seen, which was a thing he was not used to feeling from an animal and was uncertain how to classify. Witness held the 6-meter distance for 8 minutes. Its bioluminescent markings ran through 3 sequences, which Rull committed to memory because his recording equipment was back in the camp, and he was not going to reach for it. Then Witness stood, stretched in the way Nora had described in Notebook 6 as the post-assessment extension behavior, and walked back toward the ridge at an unhurried pace. Rull came inside and sat down. He said, "It came to look at me." Nora said yes. He said, "It was assessing whether I was like you." She said she thought that was probably right. She said it would take a while. She said Witness had spent 4 months assessing her before closing distance the first time, and Rull had the advantage that she was already in the camp, which gave him a context to be understood inside of. He said, "You are my reference point." She said that was one way to put it. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the gray-violet sky was shifting toward the darker color that meant the evening cooling was coming. The planet made its sounds, the deep grinding, the clicking through the rock, the wind across the mineral formations. Rull had stopped finding these sounds alarming around day 7. He found them, he had admitted to Nora on day 8, almost familiar. He looked at his notebook. He said, "I want to submit a request to the tribunal for extended mission duration." She said, "How long?" He said, 3 years, maybe 4. I want to complete the communication sequence analysis and I want to do it properly. There is enough here for 10 years of real work." She said she would co-sign the request. They sent it that evening. The tribunal's science division received it early the next morning. The review committee read it and flagged it for Quarath's attention with a note that said, "They want more time." He read the attached preliminary findings that Rull had included with the request, which covered the chemical detection data, the 6-meter approach event, and Rull's professional assessment of the communication hypothesis. Quarath approved the extension the same day, which was not something the review committee expected. He did not explain the speed of the approval to them. The explanation was simple, and he kept it to himself. The explanation was that the planet had decided something about the people on it, and the people on it had decided something about the planet, and the tribunal's job at this point was to not be the thing that got in the way of what that turned out to be. He marked the file approved and moved to the next case, but he left the URA 7 feed open on his secondary screen, the live data transmission from the camp's instruments, the atmospheric readings, the sensor logs. He did not watch it constantly, but he checked it, every day before anything else. It was a small habit, it felt like the right one.